welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin, and this is the programme where you can have all of your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. Joining me today are Tim Garratt. Welcome, Tim. This is your second show, I think.
It is.
Tim is CEO of Black Star Advisory. And on your right, Tim, is Byron Crellin, MD of Debt Squared. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to the questions. Byron, you're going first. I'm a commercial landlord with a tenant who is continually operating outside of the terms of their lease. Is there any action I can take in view of the government's COVID restrictions re-eviction placed on landlords?
I think the key point really for any landlord at this moment in time is whether they want another vacant unit. I think the key thing for any landlord is to engage and see if they can come to a conclusion that solves the problem with the tenant. The tenant will obviously know their terms and conditions of their lease. The recommendation I would give would be communicate to your tenant, put it in writing, give them a timeline to fix the issues, refer them to the lease. And if the worst case scenario is that that the tenant continues to fail to comply to their lease, then yeah, I think it would be a case of the option to forfeit is available under COVID, under the regulations that the government introduced, providing it is a breach of the lease, as long as it's not a fiscal default.
So there's a definite difference between the government's directive on eviction through debt built up through COVID as opposed to a specific breach of the lease?
Absolutely, yeah. So if it's fiscal, then absolutely not, it's off the table. If it's for other, then the ability is there for them to exercise. But again, you know, I would stress to any landlord, you know, vacant property rates are on the increase. Q4 2020 saw, you know, an increase, and COVID for the last 12 months has seen and will play out to have more properties become vacant. So I think any landlord at this moment in time would be best advised, in my opinion, to engage with the tenant and to try and get a conclusion to keep the tenant in occupation.
Are you seeing much more of breaches of lease in these current times? I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, you rent your property to a tenant, you're pretty sure you know what he's going to do. There must be the appropriate planning consent for that particular unit. So the possibilities of breaching that lease are fairly narrow, aren't they? Unless, of course, people start to become ultra entrepreneurial and start doing things that are either outside the planning scope or outside of the scope of the lease.
I think it's landlords are managing agents on behalf of landlords, and now the biggest challenge that's going to come is understanding what their portfolio looks like. There is a huge spike in terms of new businesses in a pandemic being created at Companies House. There is, in line with that, a number of companies that are being struck off. I think it was over 57,000 businesses in a strike-off petition application in Q4 of 2020. I think landlords need to understand who's in occupation. Do we have an illegal subtenant? Has a business director closed a business and just recreated a new business and carried on trading from that property, which creates a huge implication in terms of operating outside of their lease. There is now no landlord-tenant contractual relationship. So I think there's a real need for landlords to zone in terms of engagement with tenants, especially in this time with COVID. It's been so difficult with businesses being closed.
I was just thinking about this business of subletting. I mean, I suppose as a landlord, again, perhaps not a large institutional landlord, but a smaller private landlord, you're going to have a dilemma, aren't you, if you suddenly find that your property's been sublet. You know, your dilemma is, well, do I want to kick up a fuss and lose the rent, or do I tolerate this sublet that hasn't got proper consent?
Well, I think that's the key thing, is whether the subtenant is there with the acknowledgement of the landlord or where it's an unlawful subtenant. If it's a subtenant that's there with the consent of the landlord, then the landlord can, as the superior landlord, go to the subtenant and say, you need to pay your rent to me. If it's an unlawful subtenant, then there is no lease in place. There'll be implications, and Tim will probably know this better than me, in terms of regard to an insurance aspect of the property. So yeah, I think subtenants, lawful subtenants, you can deal with it. Unlawful subtenants, big red mark for landlords, big flag.
And just tell our viewers. So you've had a complaint. There's an unauthorised subtenant in there. Well, how do you physically terminate things?
So it would be a case of there is no forfeiture to take place, so a termination of lease because there is no lease. So it would be going to the property typically when the tenant is not in occupation, because we need to take peaceful possession of the property.
So the landlord would provide the keys, presumably?
No, so we would arrange to attend with a locksmith, typically, and you would go to the property with the locksmith. There's a bit of due diligence at the front end, so you would say to the landlord, you know, what's the nature of this unlawful tenant's trade? The nightmare would be it's a taxi 24/7 in operation. You know, right, okay, well that's thrown plan A. But if it was, let's just say it was a hairdresser's, then typically the enforcement agent and a locksmith will go to the property outside of their known trading hours, change the locks. The notice will be displayed on the property to say that the property has been taken back on behalf of the landlord, and then it will be a case of getting into dialogue then with that third party to allow them access to remove their goods, etc. But the key thing from a landlord is mitigating their risk and their exposure.
Okay, Tim, anything to add to that?
Well, only in that, you know, we've all seen these exact situations, and I think the key phrase that you will hear over and over again at the moment is this dialogue situation, and the problem occurs when the dialogue's not there, so that neither because it's not always landlords, it's sometimes tenants, you know, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. You're not available today.
And
that's not helpful. Yeah, that's not helpful either. But in certain circumstances, and the picture that Byron paints, where you've got an illegal subtenant, you've got to protect, the landlord's really got to protect his interests. That's what he does. But the subsequent dialogue may be that tenant might be the better bet, and actually letting them back in on a short-term tenancy at will, license, maybe a good opportunity for the landlord to rescue a position that's pretty dire up until that point. You know, the sort of peaceful possession is quite a long way down the line for a managing agent. You know, it's not quite last ditch effort, but it's pretty close too.
Are you finding a greater willingness to communicate in these times rather than, say, perhaps 2 years ago?
Well, I think we have to remember that the first default remedy for a managing agent or for a landlord is send the bailiff in, or the enforcement agent as we're referred to. So that would be the default in terms of credit control have said that they've defaulted, they're not paying, etc. You're absolutely right. The regulations and the restrictions that are in place at this moment in time are, to a degree, forcing landlords, managing agents to engage. And actually, if you've got a subtenant that's not there with your knowledge, so an unlawful subtenant, but actually transpires that they've got a good business model and it just needs tidying up and becoming put onto a legal footing, then yeah, absolutely, I think managing agents are doing that. I think it's all about communication at this moment in time and just seeing the trends in terms of who's paying the rent.
So life's not all bad in the commercial world then?
It's pretty tough.
It's been a hard.
It's not a great time to be a managing agent. No. It's a very difficult time to be a managing agent.
Well, all landlords really at the moment.
Yeah, but yeah,
very
yes, and yes, the consequence of the landlord side of this is difficult. But it's also tough being a tenant as well, because if you you can't, in some cases they can't get to the shop to open the shop. So then what do you do?
I mean, I'm quite interested as to what the attitude of some of these institutional landlords will be when the high street moves away from blue chip tenancies to pop-ups, to first time businesses, pop-ups and the sort of more casual tenancies.
I actually think that there's more airtime for that now because people don't want void spaces. I mean, there's a very well-known shopping centre in the northwest on the outskirts of Manchester. That was a flagship when it opened. Now, I think you could negotiate rents.
Okay, all right. Right, Tim. Tower Hamlets in London have recently announced a crackdown on rogue landlords and letting agents, fining up to £10,000 for the worst offences. Do the panel think that local authorities will take this up nationwide? Do they think it will improve things, and should it apply across the board to property sales and lets?
So, to some extent, it already exists in some other places. So Nottingham City has had a selective licensing system in place for 3 years. It was a 5-year pilot programme, and we're 3 years in. I think, does it work? I think the jury's out, so I'm not sure that we can hand on heart say it works. I think the City Council would say it does, because anything that raises standards of housing generally have to be seen as a good thing. So none of us want to see slum housing again, back to, you know, those sort of Rackmanism days of the sort of 50s and 60s. So in a sense, it's a very good thing. My concern with it was, when it was introduced where I live, was that it was hugely bureaucratic, and the poor old managing agent who we've just talked about, who's got, one of my friends ran a managing agent business, you know, 175 separate applications because they're separate landlords. These things are 20 pages long, and everyone is different for every single property. I think there was some evidence that the rules changed a little bit along the way, that the initial idea was that you would have to have this list of documents, and actually they dropped a few off and said, actually, we're not too worried about those. And people had already done it.
I suppose the introduction of assured short-hold tenancies helped that to a degree, because the leases were, well, when it started anyway, were relatively uniform, weren't they?
They were relatively uniform, but, you know, ASTs were introduced in the Housing Act 1988.
80, yeah.
I mean, they've been around for a long time. You know,
So
January 1989 seemed like a long time ago. I remember it coming in. Yes, they have helped, but I think what this initiative about is raising standards, and we can't sit here today and say we shouldn't raise standards. That can't be right. We have to have people living in proper places, proper homes, and you know, I think we sometimes I worry that these things hit everyone. So it's very much a big shotgun. Let's hit everyone, and actually, generally speaking, it's not everyone that's a problem. That you know, there are good landlords. There are a lot of good landlords, and there are a few bad rogue landlords, as the headline says. And you know, clearly you've got to go after the rogue landlords. But I do have some concerns sometimes that these things become just so over bureaucratic, and you know, you end up with a sort of an organisation to oversee, and overseeing quite a small part of a problem. And in the old days of when I did housing was, you know, the local authorities did have the power to go in and sort problems out.
Hello again, and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time, and joining me are Byron Crellin and Tim Garratt. Welcome back, guys. Byron, your second question. Do the panel think that there'll be a huge increase in commercial repossessions as and when COVID support finishes?
I think simply no. The government issued a code of practice at the beginning of COVID. It's all about dialogue with landlords and tenants. There are a huge backlog of arrears that's accrued with tenants not paying rent because they can't, because of not being able to trade. There are some tenants out there that are choosing not to pay rent. That's probably another conversation. But in terms of possession, the government have said that they have financed businesses through this pandemic, and it's their intention to ensure that those businesses are protected, bring them back, get them back open, but protect them. What the government have said is that they're going to update the regulations that were introduced as a result of the pandemic in terms of landlord, tenant and rent, and also possession, and that will be before the 30th of June. It is expected, and the government have said that their intentions are to phase back regulations. So I don't think we're going to have a tap-on situation where it's going to be, right, we've invested all of these millions to look after these businesses, now, Mr. Landlord, you can get on with it. I just think that what we'll now see is 2021 being a real hard slog, And I think 2022 will be no different. The government have said, and they've opened up to this already, we're now in a consultation period where they are looking at legislation for the future in terms of how landlords and tenants will operate. There is a call for evidence, which is what the government are calling it, in terms of an exercise where they are now out to stakeholders for their intake in terms of and their comments as whether the code of practice has worked, have tenants and landlords engaged. The government was promoting a partnership. I've not seen any evidence of it.
As somebody who has to deal on a day-to-day basis with debt and repossession, I suppose, do you get any more information from government in terms of guidance than the general public does, for instance? Are you privy to any?
No crystal ball, unfortunately. I mean, we are, as part of our position in our market space, certainly placing ourselves into with the MOJ to be engaged as part of open forums and give feedback. And so the government are now into this consultation period. I think possessions will happen, but I think it will be on a phase back with regulations. What we don't know is what the government's intentions are. Will they ring fence arrears that have been accrued from the start of this pandemic to when they say we're going to come out of it? What we don't know at this moment in time is whether the government are actually looking at making landlord-tenant statutory regulations in terms of commercial rent arrears recovery, or CRA, and the forfeiture of lease, abolish it in terms of notwithstanding what a lease says, but abolish it, because today in English law, commercial rent arrears recovery is the only piece of legislation where you can enforce without the application of court. You can take possession of a property without the application of a court.
Well, I presume that's because a commercial tenant is deemed to have a good understanding of what commerciality is and the consequences of signing a contract.
You would say, you would like to think so, but I think how it's transpired, the government had this appetite. They think that there's an element of these regulations that are archaic and need to be brought up to date. 2014, we saw legislation change. And now, as a result of COVID, I think we'll see legislation change again. I don't think we're going to go back to what it was pre-COVID. And I think we will see a phase back by the government in terms of rent recovery, possession. But I also think, and we're into this consultation period now, where we potentially will see a restructure of legislation in terms of commercial rent and what possession looks like for landlords, for managing agents, and for tenants.
I've heard a number of people, a number of commentators talk about effectively not ripping up, but starting again with the legislation, the legislative framework behind commercial property, the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, and I have some real concerns about that, because actually archaic because it's 67 years old. No, it works. Everyone knows in the industry how it works. It has a very clear structure. It's been legislated and been in courts for case law to death. We know exactly how it operates, and I have a slight nervousness that actually it's the baby with the bathwater syndrome, that someone says, well, it's all very unfair, we'll get rid of the whole lot. There's no reason to get rid of the whole lot. Not at all. There is a situation we have at the moment, which we're all living in on a day-to-day basis about COVID, and it's caused a major problem for everyone. For everyone, not landlords, not tenants, not, it's everyone. And to get rid of everything because of that seems to me to be a bit over the top. And I think what you will see is some special regulation around this March the 23rd to wherever we end up this year, saying actually we'll ring fence that and we'll put that in a bubble, and you'll have to deal with that in a different way.
I agree. I mean, you've got landlords that are issuing stat demands. You can't enforce a stat demand, so the courts have got a backlog. You've got rent arrears, you've got service charge arrears, you've got tenants that haven't been trading, you've got tenants that have been trading, and you've got landlords that are saying the government have basically left us out. We're out here on our own, and no one's given us any attention in terms of how we're supposed to manage this process through. And you've got private investors that are landlords. This could be their pension trust, and are now looking at this thinking, how is my portfolio savable? Is it going to come back in the way that we know it? And I think Tim's right. I mean, we've picked up that the government have got this real appetite to look at basically ring fencing and protecting businesses because they've pumped so much cash into it. And I think the difficulty that the government have got now, and I say there's no crystal ball to this, so we can only look at what the government are producing in terms of information and then be part of those consultation and provide feedback and listen to what the different stakeholders are saying from the market space. And that is that you've got a scenario where landlords will be saying, we need to collect rent. We need to take possession back because I've got tenants that can come into this portfolio. And you've got businesses that are being protected. And I think there is a real strong consideration for the government to ring fence the arrears. Even when we come out and we had this phase back scenario from the government in terms of how we're going to deal with rent going forward, this phase back, which I suspect will take us through 2021 into 2022, there will be legacy debt. And I think the government are seriously looking at this in terms of we're going to make this emergency legislation that says you can't enforce against any arrears that have accrued from this period to this period. And I think they'll do that because the amount of money they've pumped in for businesses
needs to be spent well, doesn't
Absolutely.
it, and used. Yeah, I have often thought over the years. I've been a magistrate for a number of years, and although I don't usually deal with commercial debt, you see what goes on. I've often wondered whether the county court really is the right place to deal with commercial debt in terms of rent and property.
It can't cope.
No,
I mean,
I think there's something like I think I read the other day something like 290,000 case backlog for the magistrates' courts.
There's an argument by the High Court at the moment. There is a legislation piece that says you can transfer your county court judgment from the county court to the High Court, providing it's over a salient value. The High Court market space, and I totally agree with it. That is that this market space, county courts can't cope, release some of that backlog by giving it into the High Court. Now the government, we suspect, are also considering, is landlord-tenant, the recovery of rent and taking possession in the current legislation archaic? Because we don't have to go to court to take that. I take your point that it's B2B. However, the government are taking the view that a landlord can issue a warrant by a tenant not paying rent without any engagement whatsoever, forcing them through the court route, and I don't agree with it because I think it's just going to create more bottleneck, unless the government come up with some special magic trick and say we're going to create some supreme courts and special courts.
Well, I could tell you what.
You come out of retirement.
Some of the High Court judges are going to be really delighted to have some of the county court work. Yeah, lovely. Yeah, that's really going to go down like whatever. Okay, thank you, Byron. Tim, here's your second question. Could the panel advise on the differences between investing in commercial and residential property? Which would be the best for a first-time investor and which would have a safer long-term prospect?
Another really tough question and a very good question. A question I get asked quite a bit, and I think you probably have to start the question with yourself about what your attitude to risk is, and do you have an understanding of risk? Because property returns are all about risk, and we price property on the basis of risk. So we have some very odd things happening in this market at the moment where certain risk is being profiled at unbelievable prices. So purpose-built student accommodation at the moment, if underwritten by a university, is probably achieving yields of sub 4% return. At the same time, if you have an office that's let for another 5 to 6 years, in the provinces, you might be lucky if you got 10%. And so I think it's a really wide question because you have to understand the marketplace that you're looking at. The commercial world, as we've just said, is complex. It has a series of legislation over a long period of time that sort of typify how we operate in it. The residential, we talked about that, about really it was 1989 that it changed, that it came away from the Rent Act 1977, and that market is a little more dynamic than the commercial market. But your residential route to resolving problems in debt is much harder than the commercial route. Much, much harder. So if you get a rogue tenant, talked about rogue tenants, actually dealing with them in residential is really tough. Really, really tough. Whereas in the commercial, well, rightly or wrongly, we have a much more, you talked about business to business. It's a business, not personal, it's a business. I'm, commercial landlord, you're a commercial tenant. It's not your house, it's a business, we can deal with it. Once you get into residential, it's much more emotive, much more emotive. So we saw an explosion of buy-to-let. I'm not sure that those returns are great at the moment. There's a lot of those tenants in arrears. And
of course the government are trying to discourage the smaller buy-to-let landlord, aren't they?
Absolutely. So, but they weren't 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It was the in thing to do. So I would say it's not an easy answer. I would say do your homework, talk to people in the industry who've got both residential and commercial properties, and get to understand it. It's not something you can, we've talked about this, turn up at an auction, stick your hand in the air, buy something and then think, right, okay, well I get £12,000 a year for it. You might not.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. That's a big thank you to Tim Garratt, CEO of Black Star Advisory, and Byron Crellin, MD of Debt Squared. Thank you both very much indeed. That's all we've got time for on this show, so join us again next time on Property Question Time.